Hi, Bobby. I just wanted to reintroduce myself again. My name is Minna. I am the Vice President External at the DeGroote Pride Association. We're really just a club that kind of explores the intersectionality between the corporate world and being a queer person. And so we're very excited to be interviewing you today. I feel like you are really someone that our students would find inspiration from and, take a lot of learning from. And just to start it off, your leadership has centered on equity, inclusion, and community engagement. What was the pivotal moment in your life or career that shaped your commitment to these values?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I would have to reflect back on one of the most pivotal moments in my career was actually launching, it's called the Get Real movement in Halifax. At the time, we were working with students across the region to unlearn homophobic and transphobic language and really working with students to challenge elements of discrimination. Language is learned and it can also be unlearned.
Mhm.
So I was able to see firsthand how small conversations can shift entire cultures in schools. So supporting youth to feel confident in who they are and helping peers understand what true allyship meant was incredibly impactful and really helped me, especially from a younger age, to understand my own queerness and what my own role in for self-identifying my queerness, but also in being my own ally in that community. It just showed me the power that community has and how it was rooted in education. And that experience really shaped everything that I was able to do and further advocate for my community.
That's a beautiful sentiment. I 100% agree with that. As I mentioned before to Joanna and Sandy, I'm from Calgary, and so, the queer movement's not as strong there, and you find so many wrong sentiments about the queer community, or like you mentioned, language that can be unlearned, and it's just all about that willingness and that education to learn. So hearing that is really inspiring and close to home. Second question is, in your bio, you mentioned there's a quote that says they've launched community programs that blended advocacy, education, and joy. Can you tell us the purpose that joy has served in the programs you've helped launch?
For sure. And joy, to be honest, is a form of connection and care, but at times it's also a form of revolution. And reflecting on my time at Pride Toronto, one of the programs that I'm incredibly proud of is our environmental stewardship. And with that, I was able to introduce a lot of policies and procedures and how we interact with direct vendors and communities to also just push that environmental movement. So things like removing gas-powered vehicles from the Pride Parade, investing in reusable programs such as reusable cups at all of the beverage gardens, looking at waste reduction strategies. Festivals on a whole have shockingly mass production of waste. And when I took over operations, and this is no fault to the organization, it's just something that wasn't on the radar. So looking at new measures to cut back significant amount of waste and how do we transition that waste into recyclable and compostable. So that was a huge accomplishment I have had over the years. And you know, these are serious changes, but centering those changes around joy is so important and inviting partners, volunteers, community members into those conversations and celebrate them collectively. Because at the end of the day, a lot of what I was doing was sure instinct, but also listening to community, being able to call in people, learn from their experiences, learn from their mistakes, and how do we move forward together in a joyous way. It's a reminder that activism doesn't always have to be so heavy. It can be hopeful, fun, and to be honest, future focused.
I think that's the perfect way to describe it. I feel like just as society is right now, things do feel heavy and do feel like a burden. And I think we forget that, being queer is about being joyful, and this whole experience is about, finding joy in community, just like you mentioned. And so I really appreciate to hear that. And that's the sort of sentiment you have going into these sort of projects, especially ones that are so relevant to today. My next question is, you're described as a change maker and someone who leads with bold authenticity. Has that ever come at a cost? And how do you navigate the risks and rewards of being your full true self to leadership?
It absolutely comes at a huge cost. And This question, it could not be more perfect timing because it's a conversation I'm currently navigating with my team at Tamarack because we're all change makers and we all take on a lot and we always want to make sure that we're putting our best foot forwards for community. So to be honest, at times I've been labeled as too direct or too political, especially when it comes to naming harms or pushing for change that makes people uncomfortable. But I know that when you play things too safe, hopefully that makes sense, like playing in a very safe space, it's very rare that change can happen, especially for the rate that change needs to happen. So being authentic has meant that you can show up for others who may not be able to experience the same privilege or the same power that you have in that space. And at Tamarack, it is incredibly rewarding because we're able to build that culture where people don't have to hide any part of themselves to lead. That kind of environment where it takes intention, it takes reflection and courage to be able to push back, especially when it's easier to stay quiet. But the reward is always worth it. A team that trusts each other and able to come together and align on what the mission is at the end of the day. Um, but I can't express, this question just really resonated with me because it does unfortunately come at a risk, but it's a constant balance of how do you remember what that end goal is and achieve that goal together as a team with like-minded individuals.
Mhm. That's beautiful. Yeah, 100%. And when I read the question too, I was like completely agree. That's such a thoughtful, relevant question, and it makes me kind of question my journey so far in my career and university life. So I really appreciate that. Switching gears a little, at both Pride Toronto and Tamarack, you've led during times of significant change. What strategies have helped you lead teams through transition and uncertainty?
Clarity, empathy, and process. Process is, I'm an operational professional,
Oh
so I
yeah.
do love a good process. During my time at Pride, when I took over leading of operations, I was actually inherited a $1 million deficit. That was quite a few years ago, 2019, 2020. So a lot of my focus was how do I rebuild financial systems that supported staff, especially through times of burnout and external scrutiny. The organization was also going through a bit of a PR situation at the time. Um, but nonetheless, I really ultimately tried my best to stay grounded. I created new policies. I was providing transparent reporting tools and really pathways for staff to co-create solutions. And reflecting even my brief time at Tamarack so far, we've faced a period of growth and internal restructuring. I'm guiding teams to realign how do we use project management and ground ourselves in planning those projects, looking at our policies and being as transparent with our decision making. The team, I can't take credit for this, but our team has an incredible framework called the Darcy framework that provides clear communication and tools that I've inherited myself and I even use in my personal life, which is incredible. But nonetheless, transitions can feel overwhelming. But when people know the why and the how, they regain a sense of stability. So I'm just reading the question again. So looking at times of significant change, it's a matter of how do you stay grounded, and be there and show up for your team, especially when your team is looking for a leader, but making sure that they're always a part of the equation and having those inputs to co-create solutions.
Mhm. I love that. That's beautiful. And it's definitely like good advice that can be set in every situation. But I think in this one specifically, like, it really is about just like knowing your end goal. And I feel like sometimes even I lose sight of that in times of uncertainty. I feel a little desolate and a little melancholy. And I think I just need to, see the end goal. And so I 100% agree with that sentiment. And what does compassionate leadership look like in practice for you? Is that sometimes more of being a firm person and a blunt person, like you've said you've been described, or is it more so kind of giving a gentler hand?
Yeah, this is a phenomenal question. So compassion and leadership to me, it's all about really being accountable and being human.
Mhm.
It means, sure, you may have high standards, especially in the 2S LGBTQ community when so many things are at stake. There's so many identities and oppressions and barriers and struggles. And it's hard not to want to fix everything and do it to the best of your ability, but at the end of the day, you also are only human. And it's also about how you reflect on how you're really doing, especially when you notice something is off.
Mhm.
And I believe feedback needs to be delivered with care. And even as you create policies and procedures, I'm a big believer of design thinking, which actually, DeGroote McMaster, that was my first formal introduction to design thinking, has really shaped how I even create policies and procedures now. It's
Mhm.
always reflecting back on who is that end user and how are we casting that wide funnel, but bringing things down narrow to make sure are we solving the problem that actually needs to be solved.
Mhm.
So at Tamarack, I'm implementing different systems, procedures from HR management to asking challenging questions to understand at the end of the day, are we having that best impact on who we're trying to serve? And I'm all about making sure that any structure we do create has clarity and most important, capacity. Because community work, as you are very familiar with, takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of effort, and if we're not taking care of ourselves, we could be causing more harm to that community who's relying on us to provide that support. And so to me, reflecting back, it's all about being accountable and being human.
I I love that. I know it's like my response to everything you say, but truly, I just like that sort of idea of just being human, I think is so lost and foreign sometimes in the corporate setting, especially just in today's day and age. I feel like we all need to be a little more human, take accountability, give more grace. And so just I love to hear it. Going a little off script, you mentioned that, design thinking was your introduction was at DeGroote, what sort of other tools and like building blocks did DeGroote give you at your time here?
In terms of some of the courses, I remember like project management really stood out to me. I always find it was a little ironic for timing because at the time I was working for Pride Toronto and the course was in June. So I was taking a course on project management and also project managing a massive 3 million person festival. So I was like, what are the odds? But nonetheless, it was a rewarding experience. Yes, ultimately design thinking was my ultimate favorite, project management. I really found tremendous value in a lot of the marketing and courses, especially as it related to value proposition. And even though I was always in this space, a lot of my learnings came from self-taught experiences or often being thrown into a situation and try to figure it out. So DeGroote really helped me connect dots between, my own experiences and strategy, and mostly how do I bring these into community settings?
Mhm.
There was always a bit of a gap because I did always feel that, in the landscape of business, it's always money focused or how do you grow profits or
Mhm.
shareholders and dividends, etc. And to me, it was so much more in terms of community involvement and how do we increase the voices of those who are not seen or heard. So I, in all honesty, always felt like I was the odd one out in class because there was not a lot of nonprofit representation. But if anything, it was more encouraging for me to how do I do better in this space, to
Mhm.
learn for this space so that more can go through this experience to be able to take these learnings into their own community spaces.
Mm-hmm. And I genuinely think this all kind of goes back to that idea of like, being human and, that sort of idea. And so I'm really glad that you were able to take these sort of learnings from DeGroote and apply them to where they should be and, how you can apply them to the best ability in a community setting. And I can definitely say like nowadays, I feel like DeGroote is definitely getting more community focused, I hope. And so, you're seeing a lot of initiatives on campus that I hope you'd be proud of or inspired by. How did your time in the BLPT program at DeGroote help you become a stronger business leader? I feel like we kind of touched on this before, but specifically within that program, was there anything that stood out?
Yeah, reflecting a bit on my answers, it's really about connecting the dots from my own personal values and community connections to strategy.
Mhm.
So very much I walked in with a strong community lens, but walked out with the tools to scale impact, whether it be um, financial modeling. That
Mhm.
was great. Although, to be honest, statistics, I know that is not for sure in my future directly, but nonetheless, it was a very rewarding experience. Strategic planning, project management that I mentioned, and I'm confident and proud to be able to say like I've used those skills successfully in my everyday work. Even
Mhm.
at Pride Toronto, whether it be financial situations we were in, rewriting policies, introducing tools that are still in practice today,
Mhm.
are a direct reflection of some of my learnings and experiences from the MBA program. And even here at Tamarack, I've been able, on a foundational level, whether it be budgeting, national consulting, mapping out team capacity, like all have direct connections to my experiences with the learnings I've had over like my time at DeGroote. So there's I always like to view it as what you put into something is what you get out of it. Uh, it's very common. People often say, when am I ever going to use this? Or this is irrelevant to the things I do on a day-to-day basis. But the reality is there's so many transferable things out there. And even though I made a joke to about statistics, the reality is those learnings and being able to how to read those forecasts are so relevant. And even though you're not doing it every single day, first off, you never know what positions you may be put in, but it's better to understand something versus not understand, and just be put in a compromisable position.
Mhm.
So walking away with my MBA, I was just able to have a greater sense of confidence with my own operational skill set.
Mhm. I love that, and it's great to hear. The next question is, business plays a powerful role in shaping society. How can future business leaders across any industry ensure their decisions drive positive social change, especially for marginalized communities?
There's two main questions that I always like to center, and they're used in basically any community consultation I'm doing, any project I'm working on, etc. It's who benefits and who's burdened. S- By asking yourself these questions, it really builds that accountability into your own systems, challenges yourself to think critically, and not really just about your own mission statement. Social change can't just be a side project. It has to be embedded into everything you do, from like how you recruit, how you hire, how you spend, even how you evaluate how successful your projects are or aren't. At Tamarack, like we tie all of our projects back to the decisions around theory of change and equity commitments. We just launched an amazing resource called Seeds of Transformation that is all about equity and how we're thinking about how we're showing up in communities. So when we look at how we prioritize contracts, whether they be with BIPOC or queer-owned businesses, and how we measure impact, not just by revenue, but by relationships, by our own reach. Like what is the point of this connection? These are the things we need to ask ourselves because it's more than just a dollar figure. It's how our community is able to show up and be themselves. So you don't need to be a nonprofit to do that. You just need to care enough to be able to build it.
I think that's a beautiful sentiment that many, many corporations and sort of the corporate world needs to hear. I really am intrigued by that sort of statement you said of like who benefits and who burdens. How'd you kind of get to that sort of idea?
Yeah. A lot of it comes down to when you're in a space where when people are the ones making the decision, decisions can sometimes miss that grounding element. They forget who are we really serving and why. So if you're in a group and you're missing a key representation or your key audience, how do you know you're even representing that audience? So unless we center ourselves around, any decision you make, who's benefiting from that decision and do that analysis, and then also who's burdened from this decision, it just goes into question, are we making the best decisions or are we forgetting what the true intention of these decisions are?
That's really interesting. And I really do like that. And I really think that's very important. And I definitely think I'll be taking that sentiment moving forward when we run events at DeGroote with the Pride Association. My next question for you is, what advice would you give students or new graduates who want to advocate for diversity, inclusion, and equity, but don't know where to start?
It's a phenomenal question. And um start with where you are. Start with listening. And to be honest, you don't need a title to be able to advocate. You just need curiosity, you need courage, and a willingness to get uncomfortable and to show up with vulnerability. Read widely and seek out community voices. Don't underestimate the power of asking good questions, and don't be afraid to acknowledge what you don't know. I'm guaranteed there's someone else in the room who either doesn't know as well, so it can be motivating to figure out how to solve that problem, but it's also an opportunity to give someone else a platform who knows better than you do. And when you make a mistake as well, and this is what I emphasize the most, embrace it, own it, learn from it, and keep going. Change doesn't come from perfection. It really just comes from persistence and continuing to show up. And don't be discouraged when you make a mistake.
I think that's beautiful. And when I read this question, I think it was very relevant for me too. Like I mentioned, coming into university was very overwhelming, and I was trying to find my space in my community, and I really just didn't know where to start. And so, just like you said, by listening and learning and sort of entering spaces where, maybe you're facing things that you don't know. I agree. Like, I definitely think I learned a lot through that sort of idea, but I definitely do love this idea of embrace your mistakes. I find that when I was entering the queer space and queer communities, there was a lot I didn't know, and I was so scared of the fact that I didn't know it and I didn't really understand some of the things that they were talking about and discussing. And so being able to embrace that and, saying, yeah, I don't know. Can I learn? Is such a beautiful, thought going into the spaces like this. And I definitely think I need to hold on to that. One more question is, in your view, what does true inclusion look like? And how can organizations move beyond performative practices to get there?
Yeah, like with pride, it's very sad to see some of the shifts from corporate sponsorships and also just the political rhetoric that's going out there. Even reflecting back a few months ago, in one day, a single individual was able to wipe out an entire identity within the most powerful country in the world. It's shocking, right? And so many people went like left unsupported, resources cut off, especially looking at the HIV and AIDS movement, like worldwide, the funding has just been stripped away from them. So, um, reflecting on this question, like true inclusion to me means people don't have to fight to be seen, heard, or respected. It means that the systems are built with not just for people, but who are most impacted by. So what I mean by that is, um, let me give you an example. So at Tamarack, we've actually moved away from one-off EDI training, and towards a bit more of an embedded equity program that's multi-sessions of how we make decisions, who leads projects, and how we define success. Because performative inclusion is really about optics, but real inclusion is about outcomes. So, looking at that shift, it really starts when leadership is willing to listen, leadership is willing to be challenged, and able to redistribute power. Just because someone may have a fancy title doesn't mean that they need to hold all the power, but how do we distribute that power to the folks who are going to have the bigger impact?
That's really thoughtful and really inspiring to hear. And I definitely think like that's something that I find that change makers like you are putting in the effort to do in this modern day and age, especially like we mentioned in this tumultuous political environment. And I guess another question on that, and I guess something that I find happens in the corporate workspace is, how do you make sure that you're not just a token? How do we make sure that you're not just some sort of checkbox in the corporate workplace in an EDI sort of standpoint? How do you make sure that you're not just seen as someone with a label, but you're seen as a whole, well-rounded person?
Just to make sure, are you asking me, sorry, as like as a queer person, how do I
Yes.
feel tokenized, or
Yes.
advice for people in the business space to make sure that they don't tokenize people?
How do you feel about like how's your experience with that and how do you handle that in situations?
Got it. For me, for the most part, I've if I'm ever in a situation and I feel that I am being tokenized, I am comfortable enough to speak up and address it, but in a meaningful and joyous way, and really ask open-ended questions. I ultimately don't think, for the most part, especially the organizations I'm in, are
Mhm.
ill-intended. It could always be moments of, great, we just need clarity on something, or, we thought because you may identify something, you would be the best person. To be honest, I can't even think of a recent example does this happen to me, which is great. Um, but nonetheless, my advice would be if it's safe for you to do so, is feel free to, ask those questions of like, does it have to be me to do this? Why am I the one being chosen? Because that could also open up another conversation around tokenism and what does tokenism look like, the forms of tokenism, the impacts of tokenism, etc. Like this could go down a whole rabbit hole. Um, but ultimately, my advice would be just stay true to yourself. If you feel moments that you're being compromised or being used for your identity, hopefully you can find that space and that network to rely on to be able to advocate for yourself. But also, if you don't want to be, don't be in those spaces.
100%. Yeah. I think that's really beautiful. And I think that's good advice. I find that sometimes the corporate world can be scary. We got to make sure that we are in spaces that we feel comfortable in. I think another question I have is, you mentioned, your transition from Pride Toronto into Tamarack. What sort of ideas and sort of goals did you have going into moving into Tamarack? Like, what sort of your initiatives that you really want to be focusing on at your time there?
Yeah. To be honest, my first, I'm about 6 months into Tamarack, so I'm still quite new. And one of my biggest goals coming into Tamarack was how do I make sure I carve out space and capacity to learn about all the moving pieces? Given that I am coming into the space as a new leader within the organization, the last thing I want to do is offset existing, power structures or take away opportunities from people or change things that I don't have the culture to. Um, it's always been offsetting to me when a new leader comes in and they just want to change everything, like rip everything apart, especially for an organization that is community serving. So for me, the biggest thing that I've always centered is how do I create that capacity to make sure people can come to me with suggestions of what they need support on instead of me coming to them with here's what needs to get changed. So for me, it's how do I be vulnerable? How do I build trust? How do I be open to the folks that I'm here to support, and really be that support every step of the way. It's about learning, challenging myself, challenging others, and ultimately asking questions. Being that fresh set of eyes is often helpful in situations because people are so immersed in their day to day. So I, to be honest, didn't have a concrete goal going in other than how do I be available and supportive to my new team.
Mhm. I think that's really smart, really appreciative. With our new president coming in too for the DeGroote Pride Association, I think that sentiment's exactly true. It's definitely a fresh set of eyes. I feel like we were running things so specifically and it was going well, but now that we have a new perspective, things aren't changing, but we're learning from what we've been doing. And so I'm really glad to hear that. And I'm happy to see that, you're learning and, helping so much in your new position. Thank you so much for your time, Bobby. It was really wonderful to meet you, and I definitely learned so much from our conversation. I'll be running back to my team. We have a meeting set up next week that I will be going and telling them all about it. And the DeGroote Pride Association will be walking in Toronto Pride this year, so it's very exciting to be able to meet you and see the sort of impact you make. And when we're walking the parade and we see that environmental impact there, I'm gonna be like, that was Bobby.
Well, thank you for sharing all of your stories as well and experiences. And of course, if anything else comes up, feel free, you can always reach out to me. And all the success and happy Pride Month. And
Thank you. Happy Pride Month.